Welcome to this episode of On the Front Lines. Today we are with Dr. Krithi Karanth from the Center for Wildlife Studies. She's the Chief Conservation Scientist there, and we are streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, uh, and Twitch. You can put in your comments and questions in any of the platforms that you're there. We also have Prachi from Signable, who's live translating in sign language for us. Welcome, Dr. Karanth.
Thanks, Rishabh. Thank you for inviting me.
So, of late, we've been reading about how the dolphins are back in the Ganges, how the flamingos are back in Mumbai. It seems that nature is finally reviving itself.
So this is a very interesting. I think what we're seeing is this celebration worldwide of images people are sharing of wildlife coming back onto streets and backyards. But there's a sort of a dark side to the story as well, because fundamentally, I think while those of us who live in urban areas are seeing nature come back, water, rivers are cleaner because of less pollution. The air is definitely cleaner, and animals are some number of animals are wandering around. On the other hand, we are getting field reports of increase in poaching going on the edges of many of the parks that we work around. So on the one hand, there is the joy of just seeing nature kind of come back from being pushed in the corner in certain contexts, and then in other places where fewer people are able to keep their eye on what's going on, you're seeing far higher poaching and hunting taking place as well. So it's a mixed bag. I don't think it's a clear nature's fully coming back.
Why is poaching happening, and what are these reports that you're talking about?
So fundamentally, what's happened is because of the lockdown, as most people know, that a lot of people whose daily wages don't extend beyond a week's worth of supplies for their families have either been pushed back home or struggling to get home or live on the fringes of these parks. A lot of the communities that we work with are among the poorest Indians that are there, right? And so fundamentally, without the economic support that farming gives them or grazing allows them to have, their need for protein has kind of pushed them to back to hunting, whereas earlier they would walk into a local store and buy a chicken. Right now you still have to feed your family, and so there's that aspect of it, which is just hunting for what we call wildlife biologists call hunting for the pot. And on contrast, you also have less uh, uh, the forest department in particular is really overwhelmed between trying to sort of manage poaching, fire, conflict, and all of the challenges they have. And so as there are fewer people out there, the incidents of these are going up, because killing a valuable animal like a tiger or an elephant or an otter, there is still a market for the products, right? So there are means to generate cash income. So either you consume to feed your family, or there's a means to generate cash income, and the combination of which is there's just a lot more pressure on wildlife in India today.
So you're saying that the market for animals, so to say, I'm going to say the black market for exotic animals is still alive.
Absolutely. I mean, wildlife trade is what got us to this point, right? If you speak to any wildlife conservationist, any wildlife scientist, they would probably say, I told you so, we told you so. This is something we've been aware of for a very, very long time. That when we impinge on nature in the sense that you deforest and degrade forest habitats, create access into really remote areas that nobody has gone into ever, you don't know the disease reservoirs that exists in these places, and by opening them up and increased contact with people, you're giving them the opportunity for these diseases to emerge. COVID is just an extreme example that's kind of flattened the world, but rabies, there's something called Kyasanur forest disease or monkey disease in Karnataka. There's a whole bunch of what we call zoonotic diseases. But I think the other than the larger habitat issue, the direct uh, consequence has also been particularly large scale consumption of wildlife. China, Cambodia, Vietnam, that part of Asia has, for the last 30, 40 years, consuming wildlife is very much a part of their culture. And conservationists around the world, and the supply for that wildlife comes from not just India, Africa, a lot of the world, right? And whether it's pangolins or civets or tigers or rhinos, all of it is valuable to somebody. And if you see markets in China, they've continued to operate. I mean, there was a temporary sort of ban on them, and uh, all of us in the wildlife world hoped that it would convert to a permanent ban so people stop eating wild meat. But we haven't really seen that happen. They've kind of gone back to this culture, and so this the ability for diseases to jump between people and wildlife, it comes from directly consuming a wild animal or going into really remote areas and then becoming exposed to stuff like this.
So before we go into that whole episode, could you tell our audience what a zoonotic disease is?
So I'm not an expert epidemiologist or virologist, but as a scientist, it is something. It's a disease that can transmit across species, and in this case, we've seen several kinds of mammals being affected. Right? There are reports of other than humans, pangolins, civets, and even tigers and leopards in Bronx Zoo in New York City. So this is clearly something that's able to jump and transmit very quickly.
You also mentioned that we've had zoonotic diseases in Karnataka.
Yes.
So this isn't limited to China or those regions. We've had these diseases in India as well.
Yeah. So I mean, rabies is the most common one. Everybody knows about it. There's about, I think, 30,000 deaths reported from rabies, but it's kind of known, and people know what to do and how to protect yourself, right? Foot and mouth disease, uh, which usually is in cattle and livestock, is something that's also well known. There's this, yeah. So I think COVID is kind of the extreme example of what could happen when a virus like this emerges and is able to transmit it very rapidly and spread very rapidly. And we've developed vaccines for this, but developing vaccines takes time, right? And for me, it's also the potential of the unknown. We don't know how many more COVIDs are out there. I'm not trying to be a fear monger, but I think Ebola, SARS, AIDS, all of these have emerged from people tinkering with nature and then having to kind of protect ourselves after doing the damage.
So nature is very central to this conversation, which means that the moment human habitats intermingle in some way with wildlife habitats, there is a great risk of things happening that we have no idea about. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I think fundamentally, you talk to most people today, we kind of make this very exotic, romantic view of wildlife and conservation. And people like me and my colleagues are obviously very, very passionate about the cause. But I think it's time for people, everyday people, to realize that they're not too distant from nature. Nature came knocking in a very negative way to all our houses, all our lives, and kind of flatten the world in one shot, right?
Right. So how is it that COVID-19 came into being? There's very many theories about what happened. It's just wildlife trade, but what was the kind of mechanism by which it actually reached humans?
So this is something that a lot of people are trying to figure out. They've not really pinpointed the actual source. A lot of the early science around it suggests that it is pangolins, but now there's this whole movement against bats. And a lot of my friends and colleagues who work on bats, 66 of them actually got together and have put out a lot of articles saying, please don't kill bats. Bats are not harmful, they don't spread COVID. And so we really need to sensitize people about the fact that yes, wildlife around us, they potentially carry a lot of diseases, but let's not blame one group. And again, there's strong evidence suggesting that it was the wet markets in China, but it's not 100% confirmed. I mean, if you look at the history of Ebola, if you look at Nipah virus, all of these kind of Nipah came from Malaysia, Ebola came from Africa, SARS came from Africa. All of these are variants of this, right, in terms of impact, including HIV, and that's had devastating consequences too. But I think it's time that we really wake up and realize that there are limits to how much we can impose on the planet. Whether it's eating meat or cutting down forests or really going into places and then bringing stuff out and not knowing the barriers of this.
So there is one circumstance that you've put before us where people might be killing animals out of desperation, which is when migrants are going back to their native areas. You also mentioned about wildlife trade and wet markets in China. What are those about, and why is it that these cultures um, have such a great need for exotic animals or wildlife that's not regularly consumed?
So I think wildlife have been consumed over time. I think the degree of what wildlife, which species, has varied. It's not to say that India doesn't consume wildlife. There are a lot of parts of India that you could travel to even today and see these kind of markets in certain parts of India. We know consumption of pigs and deer, and so I think fundamentally, historically, there was this dependence for protein. Not everybody is vegetarian, not everybody can be vegetarian, so the protein source was often wildlife. But as economic prosperity came in, agriculture expanded, domestication of animals took place, people have weaned themselves off a wild diet in some sense, and they were satisfied with going to a butcher shop or a grocery store and buying a chicken or buying lamb, or buying something else that was farmed meat rather than wild meat. And so for me, it's not just the migrant laborers, it's also people just living next to all of our wildlife areas. We just have 5% of India that is covered in for wildlife, and we have millions of people living on the edges of these parks. Some of the parks that we work in the Western Ghats have densities of 600 people per square kilometer living right next to the park. And when their agricultural income is wiped out, their livestock farming is put, animal husbandry is put on hold, they have to survive, they have to feed their families, so they're going to go back to the free sources that they know of, right? And so as people get pushed further into poverty, this pressure will only grow.
So obviously, there's a lot of conversation that's going around the economic impact of this virus and also the public health aspect of this virus. Do you see any conversations globally on the role of environment and how we need to work on the environment to be able to restrict these diseases to some extent?
Unfortunately, I think we're still in short-term thinking mode. I absolutely fundamentally agree that we need to make sure people are safe, people's lives and livelihoods are safe, which is that first cut assistance of providing food aid, providing access to medical care and medical protection. But once that is done, what we have failed to do is sort of set up long-term monitoring of places. We know what the vulnerable potential disease hotspots are. It is, these things usually emerge from deep forested areas. A lot of these zoonotic diseases, uh, the estimate is between 60 and 75% of zoonotic diseases have emerged from deeply forested areas, whether it's Asia, Africa, or South America. What we need to do is set up monitoring systems, so when early signs of these kind of diseases emerging, it could be rabies, it could be COVID, that when the first few set of people or domestic animals get sick, that we get the information, we don't suppress the information, we share the information and contain the spread, which is not what happened with COVID.
Right. So there's now, as the lockdown happens, we see the governments meeting and talking about the environment. In fact, the National Board for Wildlife met first time after 6 years. What happened in that meeting, and what were the outcomes?
The little I've heard is also I think this period of lockdown, that a lot of us are unable to do our daily work, which is to question when such meetings are called and ask what is being passed in these meetings. There seems to be a sudden acceleration of a lot of pending proposals for infrastructure and major projects in India, while we live in this lockdown state of online, all of us being subjected to online meetings. But clearly, so I still don't see the environment being given front seat even today, despite the direct link to COVID.
Right. So one of the news items that came out was that in this meeting, a lot of the environmental impact assessment rules were relaxed. Some projects that were going through, um, wildlife sanctuaries and parks have been passed. Um, so obviously, either the government doesn't know, or the people in power haven't been informed about, uh, why COVID actually happened. Do you think this will further have devastating impacts on the environment, and therefore result in future pandemics?
I would highly doubt that they don't know. We have an amazing principal scientific advisor, Dr. Vijay Raghavan, who is very, very knowledgeable about biology and pandemics and epidemics. So, what concerns me is I feel like a lot of things that were up for debate are no longer being given the room for debate, and priority projects are perhaps being cleared in haste or while people can't protest too much.
Right. So all of these diseases that are there, um, right now is also the time to take stock and decide what we want to do and how we want to do things to preserve and conserve nature. What do you think are the first steps towards looking at, let's say even COVID-19?
Mhm.
Everyone's predicting that we'll have, at least one more wave of this whole disease. What could we do as a society to look at, let's say, the first step of not having another disease like this?
So I think the short term, I see a lot of the relief efforts being focused on urban areas, particularly, uh, and that's fine. But there are also a lot more people in rural areas who are suffering just as much, right? And those NGOs that work on the ground in really remote parts of India, particularly those that work around wildlife areas, I think need to focus on provisioning people so that their nutritional needs are met. And this dependence on consuming wild meat certainly goes back down to what it uh, had decreased to, right? As a secondary thing, I certainly think we need a lot more monitoring of these places to track potential emergence of resurgence of COVID or emergence of new diseases that and that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment of effort from both the epidemiology side as well as the public safety side. I work at the Center for Wildlife Studies, and one thing we've done at CWS is we've been designing a public safety program that is now going that we're hoping to scale across the entire Western Ghats in India and reach about 1,000 villages. These are the most remote villages that are either inside or adjacent to 66 parks from Maharashtra, Goa, Karnataka, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu, and really directly reach out to the most vulnerable people. These guys a lot of these communities don't have cell phone access, they don't get information, they may not even have heard of COVID. And so get them access to what is going around, figure out how to stabilize their lives, and also give them information. Originally, our plan was to work on larger conflict, which we have for the last 2 decades, but we now are partnering with different health NGOs to really look at what can we do about the disease transmission side. They're all aware of rabies, but can we kind of identify the top 5, top 10 zoonotic diseases that people are most vulnerable to and can be exposed to, and kind of share the information, then create a monitoring system where we have sort of village guardians who start to report in information over the long period of time, long past COVID occurring, us surviving it, and well into the future. So we are setting up this monitoring framework as well.
Right. So one of our viewers, Arvind Seshadri, asks that is vegetarianism the only way to prevent something like this from happening again?
I I see. I'm not a vegetarian. I think it's wonderful that a lot of people can be vegetarian. Fundamentally, people have met their protein needs from domestic chicken, farmed livestock, and I think as long as we manage and animal husbandry in a safe way, it is okay and possible for people to consume meat. I'm not advocating a high, heavy meat diet, but I don't think you can dictate people's individual choices.
Sorry. Another viewer has a question: is what is the effect of COVID on conservation? Has it had a positive effect or has it had a negative effect?
I think in a very superficial way, you know, seeing these images of animals emerge has kind of restored optimism that nature can heal itself and recover pretty rapidly if people step away from messing around with nature. But I think the long term effects are going to be severe, they're going to be impactful, particularly for the people who live right next to wildlife. As they're pushed further into poverty, as they're unable to meet their livelihood needs, their dependence on the forest is only going to grow. And unless the rest of us figure out ways to support them, recover their farm incomes, recover their animal husbandry incomes, they're going to be very heavily dependent on free resources. And that is going to put a lot of pressure. The other impact, I think, Rishabh, is also this is something a lot of NGOs in India are going to face, and we're already seeing that a lot of organizations depend on funding to run, and we're already seeing this sort of donor pullback, donor change in attitudes in terms of what they should be funding versus pulling back from things they've funded for a very long time. And I think that will have impacts because there's an amazing number of NGOs. I know of a lot of amazing wildlife NGOs, but there's a lot of social sector NGOs working in education, working in public health, working in livelihoods, and the wildlife NGOs working in all of these remote places who are actually assisting people. And when you remove these support structures, there's kind of going to be a collapse.
And when you say a collapse, so it's an interesting point. So you're saying that a large part of conservation in India is done by non-profit organizations?
The management of the parks is done by the government, but a lot of support services is certainly done by conservation NGOs, particularly around wildlife areas. There's a lot of investment of time and energy and resources into communities, into ensuring that the wildlife are safe as well as the people being safe.
And when the support system is destroyed, what kind of secondary effects do you imagine?
I think, it's taken us a long time, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, to get India to a point where there is some level of progress, there's some level of prosperity. Yes, there's still a lot of challenges. And I feel like this will kind of push us back 20, 30 years if we're not able to stabilize the lives of the poorest marginal people.
So you also spoke about the number of viruses that are there out there, and the number of sort of things that we don't know about within wildlife. If there was a way, what could be the best way to map some of these things so that we could be prepared in advance and make them publicly available?
So fundamentally, being a scientist, I believe that you have to collect data, you have to collect evidence, and you have to do this systematically over time. And so we have to sort of have the healthcare sector, particularly epidemiologists, virologists, the wildlife biologists, and kind of this enmeshing of there's this concept of one health that people keep talking about, of bringing different disciplines together to tackle one issue. And COVID is is a brilliant example where a lot of different domains could come together, pool their knowledge, and you set up sort of monitoring and testing that's done periodically on a very large scale, so that it's not done once something happens, it's done before something happens.
And do you see any of these efforts happening in India or abroad, which are exciting or which are worth looking at?
I have some friends and colleagues who've been working on some zoonotic diseases, but they don't receive the kind of funding that they need to kind of set up large scale monitoring. So I think, I'm aware of some really large funding sources being available because of private initiatives now in India, but they're all kind of focused on the immediate, putting the band aid on food rations and protective equipment, when you really need to set up long term monitoring. So I think investing in research, investing in science, getting clusters of people from different disciplines to work on this is possible, and it doesn't take that much effort to do that.
Right. Um, so, if you were to suggest some steps to say, let's say partnering with health NGOs or health initiatives that are taking place, what could that look like, and how would that sort of work for the next 1-2 years to kind of prepare us for the, let's say, the next big super virus?
So I think there's two sides to it. One is understanding the biology of these viruses, which I think trained professionals should be doing, and that involves testing and collecting enough samples and following some of these diseases over time and tracking what builds immunity, what causes spread, which I think a lot of people from the health sector can do. The other side of it is actually engaging directly with people, which is something CWS has done for a very long time, and making people aware of what these zoonotic diseases are, what are the potential risks, how do you keep yourself safe, and what needs to be done to collect and maintain this kind of information long term. There's a lot of tech investment in apps today. We could very easily generate an app that is kind of shared with lots of people, so they can report and stuff, and perhaps most of the time they would have nothing to report, but the ability to kind of make this open access, something on a mobile phone that people can sort of sense that something strange is going on and fill in information on a real time basis, rather than 2 months in or 3 months in, which is too late.
So it's somewhat like an intelligence bureau report,
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
the decision makers can decide whether something's actionable or not.
Yeah, and there's enough technology to do that today, so it really needs people of different disciplines coming together and doing this. And we are hoping to collaborate with a few health NGOs and a few technologists to get some of this up and running, because I believe in the long term. I think there's a lot of people doing a lot of good for the short term impacts, but this doesn't solve the problem, and we need to kind of ensure that another COVID doesn't happen 5 years down the line or 20 years down the line.
One of our viewers has a question. Timingalam, uh, and he asks, since the COVID emerged and spread in the wet market of China, but not in millions of indigenous communities, isn't marketization of wildlife meat the problem rather than local consumption of meat?
I think in the case of COVID, certainly marketization of wild meat, which has happened now since the 1970s in certain parts of Asia, it's very much a part of their culture, is a problem. But there's enough other zoonotic diseases that exist in India, backyards, that could emerge from local consumption of meat. And I think it is important to be aware that it is potentially possible even here.
Another viewer, Amit Lahiri, asks that there is such little international pressure to stop such wildlife markets, which is worth billions of dollars. How come such little conversation is happening on such a relevant issue?
I love this question. I think, you know, those of us in the wildlife community hoped that this would be a real wake up call to kind of fix some of the major issues with how we practice conservation, how we practice research. And I don't see that happening. Uh, the bans have not been permanent. There have been these temporary bans that are lifted. And, I think there's a lot of rhetoric now on economic sanctions and how this affected a bunch of people around the world. But I think we need to kind of add wildlife to that, saying, fundamentally, this goes back to wildlife trade and wet markets, and what is our long term solution to that? And not just in China, this is around the world. What is it going to take for people to stop eating wild meat, stop poaching rhinos, stop poaching tigers, and really value the planet and ensure that we save all creatures and not just us?
Do you think there are also cultural and political elements to this?
Absolutely, there are deep, deep cultural elements to this, which is why I kind of address the vegetarianism kind of angle to it, right? Uh, there's huge variations in how people view life. And India in particular, a lot of our work has shown that people are inherently tolerant of loss, right? You could have an elephant raiding your crops 30 times a year, or a leopard or a tiger killing your livestock. Most of the families we've worked with or surveyed across India don't retaliate. The retaliation comes when there's human injury and human death. But unfortunately, the world is not India. So there's a lot of cultures where life, other kinds of life don't get that kind of value. And so how do you inculcate that? How do you inculcate behavior change? A lot of people have been working on behavior change, particularly focusing on the Chinese, because they're such a driver and sort of demand for this, right? And nobody's really kind of succeeded in inducing behavior change.
But are there positive spots? Are there success stories of some kind that you know of and can share with us?
I think, I mean, certainly, if you look at wildlife as a whole, there's been a lot of recovery of wildlife. Say in India in the 1950s, 60s, if we went back to many of these places, there was no wildlife. The combination of good protection, setting up parks, a lot of investment by different NGOs of time and resources has brought back wildlife. And 2020, India is far richer for a lot of it than say the 1950s. But I don't think we should be satisfied with where we are. There is room for more wildlife in India. There is space for coexistence. There is space for sharing space with wildlife, and it shouldn't just be about people.
But the interesting, I mean, you'll have the statistics for it. But hasn't wildlife cover reduced between independence and now?
So if you look at, there are populations of wildlife that have recovered and rebounded from the 1950s to now, right? But if you kind of set the timestamp as a 200 years timestamp, there's been a lot of declines of species across India as a country. So it's really what period are you looking at? I think post 1970s, we've done a reasonable job in bringing back wildlife in a lot of places. The question is, given an economy that's growing at this rate, given a population and associated pressures with it, can we hold on to what we have? Can we potentially increase space for wildlife? Can we reduce backlash against wildlife? So, not get people to blame bats and not get people to blame other wildlife species for COVID, when inherently we went in there and messed with these animals.
So essentially what you're saying is that this whole philosophy that uh, our environment is as much ours as much as it is for other species, that belief is what's going to encourage conservation, encourage creation of spaces for wildlife. So one aspect of it is awareness, but the other aspect of that is also policy making. Have you seen positive steps in policy making, irrespective of COVID? which encourages creation of more habitat for wildlife, or even coexistence of humans and wildlife in various places.
If you look globally, I think there are examples. In India, I can't think of too many. I actually think there was a lot of initiative in the 1970s for wildlife. We've not had, in fact, now a lot of the laws are being weakened, a lot of the environmental clearances are being online. So somehow in policy making, or there's a prioritization of economic and development needs. And I don't think you can argue that it's a no, no, no everywhere. There are places where we will have to make sacrifices to put people first, but there have to be some places where we have to make sacrifices to put animals first. And figuring out these trade-offs is really, really important. I don't think it's a one-way story either way.
On that note, one of our viewers, Abhay Jain, asks that, are you apprehensive about the government pushing development projects, compromising with environmental issues in the name of addressing economic concerns created by the lockdown?
Absolutely. And the first example I can think of, which is one of the biggest challenges we have in India today, is infrastructure, right? You need highways, you need better railways, you need energy infrastructure that is going to support an economy and a population of this size. But as part of the economic recovery, uh, I think, other than the existing and planned infrastructure projects, one of the classic ways that governments react to a crisis like this is invest more in infrastructure. And I think creating more roads, more highways, more railway lines is going to be extremely destructive and to the few areas that we have left. So my actually I think biggest longer term pressure point is the infrastructure development that might emerge.
So there will be a lot of space once this sort of lockdown opens up for governments to seek inputs from citizens. How, as ordinary citizens, do you think we can participate in efforts to conserve more and to keep this sort of spirit alive? Right now, outside my house in the nights, I can hear crickets, which I never heard before. And it's a very pleasant feeling. Often in phone calls and in Zoom calls, we hear birds chirping. Uh, is there any way, you think, is there a new sense of awakening, at least in urban populations? And is there any way we can keep the spirit alive?
So I think, fundamentally, every single one of us is connected to nature. As a kid, you want to be outdoors, you want to play in mud, you want to look at birds. And somehow, as we become adults, we start to lose that fundamental connection. And I think this being locked in our houses has certainly taught us. I have monkeys outside my window, I have birds outside my window. And, I miss going to the forest. Like for me, fundamentally, I used to spend my life every month getting out somewhere because that's what kind of restores my soul. And I hope that inkling of her, hearing crickets and hearing birds gets people more conscious of inherently having this connection, but either suppressing it or been too busy and ignoring it for this long, to kind of change little things that they do to somehow inculcate an appreciation for nature in their lives.
I want to press upon one point. So, what is it about? So, nothing prevents an animal or a being to come into these environments, right? But it's taken a lockdown for these other sort of populations on this planet to come back. Let's say to an empty street in Ireland, or on the streets in Kerala. What is it about human presence that deters animals from engaging, or that prevents them from coming into normal, regular urban or even rural spaces?
So, I mean, I can give you the example of roads, which is the most obvious one, right? If you see roads anywhere, high traffic density, movement of traffic, noise, all of this deters animals even crossing a 6 foot wide tar road, right? So there is this inherent, I don't know, fear to take that chance to cross a road, and suddenly there's an opportunity where there are no people. All that noise, all the stuff that kept animals kind of at bay is gone, and so I think the bolder ones are venturing out just to check out things.
So another questions come up. Amit Lahiri asks that there are so many conservation agencies across the world. Do they not have any say in shaping public policy sparked by the COVID situation?
I think there will be a concerted effort globally. There are bodies like the UN. There are mechanisms where a lot of these conservation NGOs can get together and make an even stronger case. And I think definitely a lot of us will be involved in that effort. But they shouldn't fall on deaf ears. We need people in power, people in government, people in policy to listen to us and not continue to ignore us.
Do you think globalization has had a role in massively increasing wildlife trade and not even increasing, facilitating the increase of wildlife trade? And as we sort of move into this post-pandemic era, uh, do you think exploring localized models of living, especially economic models of living, would that stop wildlife and wildlife hunting?
I think globalization has a big role to play because earlier perhaps trade occurred between states, between neighboring countries, uh, where it was easy to, covertly smuggle body parts of animals or entire animals. Now with the internet, there are a ton of sites that where you can go and buy orchids and buy a lot of animal parts, and none of that has shut down, right? So the combination of the internet and accessibility has made suppliers and buyers connect in a way that's never happened before, right, in the last 20 years. So you could be sitting in America and want something from India, you could be sitting in China and ask for something from South Africa. So the ability to make these connects yeah, has certainly grown, as well as just access to travel and transportation opportunities also makes this stuff easier. And the volume of, sometimes you read these seizure reports of what was seized, and 20,000 kilograms of pangolin meat, hundreds of star tortoises in one seizure, thousands of kilograms of scales or meat or bone being traded. It honestly, it's very hard to detect a lot of this, right? So detection rates are really low, and after that prosecution is even lower. Most of these cases fall apart, at least locally, in the courts, because the evidence has not been collected properly. Even the ones that make it through into the court system, the fines and the punishments are still very low, so it needs fixing at different levels.
So, one of our viewers, Darshan Khatao, asks that how is CWS participating in educating people on the fringes of parks and sanctuaries on various zoonotic diseases?
So we are planning to launch a public safety program that will engage with over 1,000 villages in many parks, and we want to focus on the Western Ghats. I think there's a lot of NGOs who will focus on other parts of India, but we fundamentally want to get to the most remote people who may not have even heard of COVID even today because of lack of access to a mobile phone, cell phone connectivity, and do things to help protect them, keep them safe, and make them aware of the how to keep yourself and your family safe long term.
Do you would you plan on working with the government at a national and state level once the lockdown is over? And if yes, what kind of structural reforms would you recommend to the governments?
So absolutely, I think a lot of this wildlife has become pretty decentralized. So although policies are very national level, it's really key to build state level partnerships. And we would very much want to partner with a lot of state governments to see first what is the kind of support we can give them. We have done some frontline support with as simple things as masks not being available for the guards and the watchers and frontline staff who are out there trying to protect these areas from poaching, from fire, and they don't have basic equipment. And so we are doing that kind of short-term support, but really long-term is to look at setting up monitoring so that you can go back to places over time and see which places are real hotspots for diseases, which places are not hotspots, and keep a much closer eye on these places.
And what kind of technology would be helpful in actually identifying these spaces?
So collecting data of different kinds, and I think this is where the epidemiologists come in for the kind of information they collect. Remote sensing is important to kind of look at habitat change and land use change over time and see what the vulnerable exposed areas are. Uh, Wildlife biologists are important because you can particularly monitor different mammal species, and clearly in the case of COVID, it is something that jumps a lot of species, and so you need to keep an eye on wildlife showing symptoms or even reverse transmission from people and livestock giving something to wildlife, which has happened as well, right? So it's monitoring both sides.
One of our viewers, Ashish Vyas, is asking, by large, the problem is consumerism. Um, if the rural population has always lived in peace with wildlife, is it possible to sort of reduce this consumerism by adopting local models of living?
Absolutely. I don't. I wouldn't. I think I wouldn't say they've lived with peace, but they've certainly lived in tolerance of their losses, and in awareness that these places are shared. They're meant to be shared between people and animals and not for the sole use of humans. And I think that's where all of us who live in cities have lost that connection, which anybody in rural India will tell you today. No, I see jackals in my field at night. I see elephants. I see pigs in my village, right? And that's not something urban Indians typically see. So I think encouraging local ways to live sustainably will be very, very important.
But there is an inherent contradiction in this in urban areas also, because most populations, even in urban areas, are migratory populations. Someone like me is in Bangalore today, could be elsewhere. So there's no incentive for me to participate in any local conservation effort. In
And
fact,
then
I
I
don't
would
think.
say support a national effort, right? I'm sure there is some part of India that you might feel more attached to or care for, or there's some animal you feel more attached to, and try and do something for those places and those animals. It doesn't have to be something physically in your backyard, but I think everybody has the talent, the resources, the skills to help at this point.
In all these weeks of the lockdown, while there's been so much focus on, the urban poor and the kind of distress that various sections of society is facing, do you see any positive areas emerging with respect to people looking at nature? I mean, one of the things that we see is people taking photographs of these birds, or whether the Ganga cleaning itself in parts. Um, do you have any positive stories where people have sort of resolved to conserve their local spaces? Is there any story of hope that we have from within India?
So I love seeing these images because it's showing me that people are inherently connected to nature, whether it's the rivers, whether it's having seen the Himalayas after 30 years from some parts of India, or whether it's a little bird uh, outside your window, right? So those connections to nature can be hugely different. What I'm hoping is that it stays past the lockdown, and people kind of look at ways that they can continue to maintain that connection and it not just be a 2 or 3 or 6 month phase in their lives.
There's also been suggestions of locking down the world every once in a year for 15-30 days, so that the pressure on the environment is released as a way to tackle this. Do you think that that sort of a suggestion is reasonable?
I don't think we can lock down the world for a month, but I think work from home, a lot of us have proved that we can work from home. I'm very fortunate in that certain teams in CWS are working at full capacity despite the lockdown, right? We have been productive, we have delivered, and we are doing meaningful things. So I do think certainly looking at work from home opportunities have to be provisioned in every organization regardless of what you do, and not just the IT sector. And even having people off the roads 2 days in a week instead of 5, all of these will help, right? I think it's reducing pollution, reducing consumption of certain kinds of resources can be done, and it doesn't have to be this extreme 1 month thing, but a periodic thing of once a week or couple of days in a month can be set aside. But I think long term recovery takes time.
Finally, you know, before this whole lockdown, there was an momentum gaining across the world with respect to climate change and some sort of consciousness, at least in the middle class, with respect to the environment. Obviously, those conversations have stopped. And and do you think climate change will it ever catch public imagination in the same way it had in the last few months?
I think climate change is very much linked to this. I think people talking about cleaner rivers, cleaner cities, lower air pollution, being able to see the sky and sun in places, I don't think climate change will disappear off the table. I think if wildlife trade and disease transmission make it onto the table with climate change, we'll be in great shape. I don't think that climate change is actually going to be ignored because of this, because people have seen even within 2 weeks or a span of 30 days how much cleaner the environment is. Air pollution clearing over many cities, rivers being cleaner. I think it's made it even more obvious how quickly recovery is possible in some contexts.
There's a question that's come in, and the question is: conservation policy and economic policies have negatively impacted indigenous communities for long. What should be done so that post-COVID conservation policies do not follow along the same lines?
I think these are the most marginalized communities in India, and what worries me is they're still not connected to a large part of the Indian economy or other Indians, and to safeguard them is definitely a priority because they are the most vulnerable. At the end of the day, they are the first line of defense. At the end of the day, they're also probably the first ones to get exposed to something like this if something like this were to emerge in India. So from a health perspective, from a livelihood sustainability perspective, and a protection perspective, they absolutely need to be made aware and involved in this.
I think that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Karan. Thank you for all the viewers for being with us and asking some very critical questions. And thank you, Prachi, for translating in sign language. Thank you.
Thank you, Rishabh.
Yeah.
Bye. Stay